My name is Ryan Cloutier, and I am the acting FIM Program Manager. I say acting because I'm taking over for Heather Leascheid. That's who's featured in this picture here. So I'm pretty new to FIM, or FIMP, as I'll introduce you to. It's a new acronym. It's really chaotic with acronyms, so I apologize up front, but we've decided to call it FIMP. And I'll speak more about that on the next slide when I put it all together. But I'm new to FIM. I'm a biologist with an identity crisis. So I'm not sure if I'm a marine biologist anymore or if I'm a freshwater ecologist. I'm still figuring that out. My formal training is as a marine biologist, and I started my career in Vancouver. And I recently moved to Nelson about 3 years ago. And of course, have been kind of expanding and becoming more freshwater, more of a freshwater specialist. Okay, so with that, I'll take the next 4 slides to speak generally about Foreshore Integrated Management Plan project. And that's the big term that we give to sort of 3 subcomponents of the program that, we talk about these 3 things quite regularly. So I'll introduce the history, the framework, and then a bit more about the current project. So Heather and Bruce, you might know Bruce MacDonald as well. They put together a successful grant application to DFO and won some funding to carry this work forward. So to survey more lakes and to refine the methodology or update the methodology. There we go. So as I mentioned, there's tons of acronyms. So I've put a list of acronyms up here, and you can refer to it. I won't read them out, but it gets confusing. So there it is to kind of help us along. So the history of FIMP, again, Foreshore Integrated Management Planning is the overarching term that we're going to use. So the history of FIMP really started back in 2001 with the sensitive habitat inventory mapping methodology. And this was a methodology that was designed for use on streams. And it was developed in the Lower Mainland, so in Vancouver area. And as you know, there's tons of tiny streams there that provide really important habitat for coho and other salmonids and other aquatic species. So DFO and MOE wanted to start inventorying and mapping these streams and cataloging them, and they needed to formalize a method so that things were consistent and comparable. So they wrote up this report here, 2001, and it really was the foundation that FIMP has built upon and used to move forward. In 2005. The Regional District of Central Okanagan took shim and applied it on a lake, a big lake, Okanagan Lake. And so this is really a transition period for shim becoming FIMP or FIM, Foreshore Inventory and Mapping, as you're probably all familiar with. So it was a successful project. They used the methodology, did it on a lake, and again, it still was shim, but being applied to a lake. It wasn't until 2009 that the methodology became FIM, and a consultancy based out of Kelowna called Ecoscape wrote up the methodology, published it, and that's really been the guidance document for how to do one of these surveys that's been used for the last 10 years. And as you can imagine, there's tons of lessons learned between then and now. And so part of the FIMP project that Bruce and Heather sort of started is to refine this methodology, update it, and take all of the lessons learned and put it back into this sort of this early version and develop an updated version. And the updated version, it didn't change too much. Really though, we really spent a lot of time trying to explain the core technical analysis. So that's going from the field survey, collecting the data, down to mapping the final product. So Andrea showed us the maps with the color ecological rankings, the colored shorelines. So getting from collecting the data down to mapping those shorelines there's quite a complex technical analysis that I don't think it was fleshed out, well enough to be really easy to understand and implement. So we've worked on improving that. And anyways, in 2020, we completed, or 2019, we completed that document. We're calling it a draft because we plan to field test it this field season, this summer, and probably make some slight adjustments, and then it'll be a final methodology manual, if you will. So that's a bit about the history. For me, knowing this is important because it gets buy-in from a scientific credibility standpoint. It's been used for 20 plus years. It's been used by multiple agencies. A good number of quantitative biologists, ecologists have used it and refined it. So for me, it is credible, and it's solid. So that was the point of this slide, is to just show you that. All right, so the next slide here is going to be a diagram showing the 3 subcomponents that I talked about. So again, more acronyms. It's really hard to wrap your head around at first. So I came up with this diagram to just help put it all together, and it's really great. It'll help me walk you through the process of doing a FIMP survey and getting all the way down to that final report. So the first part is the foreshore inventory and mapping component. That's really the data collection, going out and doing your field surveys. So you can see in that first green box, field surveys. Drive around the lake in a boat and count everything you can. It's a little bit more complicated, but you're counting the number of docks, swim platforms, distribution of substrates on the foreshore, emergent, submergent vegetation, et cetera, et cetera. So quite a lot goes into the field surveys. But then there's also a really important component, the desktop review. So there's tons of provincial databases that have information about species at risk occurrences, critical habitat layers, and what have you. So we really encourage analysts to get those data and include them in your data set, essentially. And then, as Nicole mentioned, there's the First Nations traditional ecological knowledge component, and the methodology allows the incorporation of that if it's available. It's not always going to be available, but depending on the project, it may or may not be. So those are the three bits of information that go into the FIM component, the field or the data component. And that information gets summarized in a FIM summary report. Now, the FIM summary reports aren't, they're not like the integrated synopsis of what's going on. They're really a snapshot of different variables on the lake. So it's a snapshot of what's going on the lake. So again, the number of docks summarized, put in a figure, put in a table, the number of groins, boat launches, distribution of substrates and things like that. So if you want sort of, I guess it's baseline information, essentially, summary of what's going on in that lake, you can pull up these reports and get a good idea of what's going on. All right, so the next component is well, I'll start with the old acronym first, the Aquatic Habitat Index. And you see I've got it in brackets there, AHI. We've renamed this thing to the Foreshore Habitat Sensitivity Index. So this is what I mean by our core analysis. So we take the data from the FIM and run it through a sort of quantitative analysis. And the goal of the analysis is to take all those variables, compress them into something a little bit more easy to understand, intuitive, and applicable. So the nuts and the bolts are done in the background, and then the end result is that five-point ecological ranking scale. So from very low to very high habitat quality or habitat sensitivity. Okay, so it's also important to note that not all of the field data that gets collected goes into the FHSI. Some of it is just in the FIM summary report, and some of it goes into the final or the core analysis. As you see, the First Nations TEK information can take one of 2 paths. It can be incorporated into the core analysis, the FHSI, if it is unmasked and quantitative. So For a lot of reasons, First Nations TEK data will be sensitive and masked. And if that's the case, we can't really include it in that quantitative analysis. Also, if it's qualitative information, we can't include it because there's a lot of math and things that happen in the background there. So depending on the nature of that information, it gets carried forward in one of two paths. All right, so that's the second main component of the FIMP project that we talk about. The third one is the one that Andrea spoke a lot about, was the shoreline guidance document, which we've now renamed as the Foreshore Development Guideline Report. So FDG, if you will. And this is kind of the final report that a lot of, that a lot of people use in day-to-day, in your day-to-day jobs, I guess. And again, it carries forward the results from that core analysis, the habitat sensitivity map. So the entire shoreline of a lake will be mapped and assigned a habitat ranking, again, low to high. And then with that map, you have the development guidelines that accompany it. So as Andrea mentioned, the activity risk matrix, or the ARM, is the core development guidelines that are created and support the interpretation of the habitat sensitivity map with the desire to develop on the foreshore. And you can also see the First Nations TEK information. It's carried forward. If you look straight down, it's carried forward either as First Nations traditional ecological knowledge polygons. So the information is mapped spatially and flagged for people to see and know that it's there. So it's to show that there's known fish and wildlife First Nations values in those places. And depending on the project, specific activity risk matrices or matrix can be developed for these polygons. But if they're just mapped, the ARM does not apply to the First Nations TEK polygons. And they can't, because they're very, very different. And if they're sensitive information, we don't really know what's there. So you can't apply the existing ARM guidelines to the TEK polygons, for example. Okay, so I think those are the three things that we talk about. And the last piece of the puzzle, which I want to highlight, is implementation. And it seems a little cliche, but it's really motivating for people like myself and others who are doing this work on the other side to see that it's getting used. So essentially, thank you for being interested in this and having and using this information, because it's all fine and dandy to do your surveys, collect your data, do your analyses, write it up. But if it doesn't get used, if it doesn't support, decision making, then the impact of the program is really reduced. So I'm pleased to see coming onto this project that it's got a good track record of implementation and use. So wanted to highlight that. All right, so the last slide, I'll just speak really generally about the current FIMP program. As I mentioned, Heather and Bruce put together the grant application, so it's important to acknowledge them. Heather had a baby, so she's on mat leave. I don't think I mentioned that, but I'll be in the picture until early next year, and then she's gonna come back and take over. So I'm working with Bruce right now. The project started in 2019, and really late 2019, so we're just coming to the end of our first year, and it's gonna go until 2022, 2023, just because of the way the fiscal years line up. But there's 3 more years worth of funding where we're gonna do more FIMP surveys, more outreach, and a few other things, and I'll come back to that in the next pop-up. The project's funded by DFO, and actually it's funded by the Canadian Nature Fund for Aquatic Species at Risk. It's a sub-program of DFO, so it has a species at risk bent to it. So just like to acknowledge that. And at the high level, the objectives of the program are really to update the methodology, do more surveys, so write more shoreline guidance documents, and implement and encourage implementation. So outreach and training and helping people become more familiar with the documents essentially is really important. So to date, in 2019, we finished that methodological update. So it's a 100+ page FIMP manual, if you will. So if you want to do a FIMP survey, everything's there. That's going to go live, like I said, probably the end of this summer. We'll finalize it and distribute it. We prioritize which lakes we want to have surveyed in the Upper Columbia Basin. So we have work happening this summer. 2 to 4 lakes will be surveyed. And then another big part of the puzzle is this data management. And data management's been a challenge. And as probably a few of you know from using this, the documents are not located in a centralized location. So it can be a little tricky to get a hold of them. I think in the past, we've tried our best to directly source it to different levels of government to use. But what we're looking to do in the future is create a central place to house the data, to provide access, and to outline the data sharing protocols and whatnot. So we want to make that easier for people to access and make a one-stop shop essentially. So the data management piece will get carried forward into this year, and by the end of this year, we should have that done. And then in 2020, as I mentioned, there's going to be some summer field work happening. We'll have 2 to 4 lakes surveyed, and by the end of this year, we'll have 2 to 4 more shoreline guidance documents completed. So hopefully you can add them to your toolkit. And again, a bit more outreach and training, just both at the consulting level and user level. So folks like yourselves who are using them, just help encourage people and get people familiar with what these documents can do.